so that in the end, you just have to export a CSV file, and this one you can take then to import directly.
Today we're talking about relaunching websites, content migration.
Yay. I'm not going to ask what is it.
What is there to know?
So a lot of the times we have to relaunch websites, right? So it's not like a new website that we make up from scratch or somebody made up from scratch and we develop it, but we have an existing website and need to implement a new design, a new infrastructure, a new app for that. And there's lots of things that you need to consider when you do that. And the first thing we want to talk about, and maybe we make a small short series out of that, is content migration. So migrating the content, getting the content that is already there in the old site into the new website, into the website that we develop. And what are the challenges, Stefan?
I think most people, first of all, think that there shouldn't be many challenges, because many times I get asked by people who would like us to relaunch the website, well, that should be simple, right? And I'm like, not really. It depends. It really depends. Of course, people think it might be easy because it's the same system as WordPress. But WordPress has so many different types of page builders, and there are so many different variations on how you can structure your content. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And my quick and easy answer that I like to give is content that is rather structured, can be migrated rather easily, but still there are challenges. But content that is unstructured, so more like stuff coming from a layout builder, this is harder to migrate.
And actually, WordPress doesn't have to be the existing website, right? So the existing website can come from any sort of technology. But when you have WordPress and you migrate to a new WordPress system, some people think, that's easy. And in theory, there is the WP content, which is the dump for everything. And pre-Gutenberg, it's basically only HTML with maybe some images, some extra markup that you can add and so on. And theoretically, yes, you could just simply take that and put it into a new installation. But our approach is a bit different, right? We want to have, or we have the components, or in Gutenberg, there are blocks. And migrating from a non-block, non-component-based system into a block or component-based system can be a bit tricky. You need an exact mapping, for everything that is possible in the old website. You need to have a mapping how this relates or translates into the new website. And this is basically where the challenges are, content-wise. And then, of course, there might be structural differences as well, because besides regular content, sometimes in not so structured CMSs, you, for example, have tags or categories that are just inside of the post content and not a specific database, extra entity or whatever. And then extracting this from the existing website can also be a challenge.
Yeah, right. And when you have pages that are redesigned, I think that should be rather obvious, that then it's even hard to do any kind of migration, because the actual content and appearance of content likely will change. On the old site, you might have a different sized image for the header section, and then in the new design, right? So this likely needs to be redesigned, or you need to at least upload the image again so it can be put into new proportions. But most of the times it's much more than that. The entire page content changes on how the page is structured and so on. So I think the best way there is always to just recreate those pages. You can, of course, open up your existing CMS or website and see what parts you want to transfer, but you actually should just re-enter the content for those types of important landing pages. Everything else would be just super complicated, and you can do that, but if you do that, you have to put in a lot of extra work anyways, going over those migrated pages to re-edit and optimize things which might not just be perfect yet. But I'd say I'd rather like to agree on this shouldn't be done, like migrating these designed landing pages.
I mean, a lot of the times a redesign comes also with a change in like communication strategy or something like that, right? And then for these pages, like you have like new copy that's created or new images that are being taken and so on. So yeah, I would totally agree with that this sort of content usually doesn't get migrated, but will be created from scratch. But for like blog posts, articles, news, events, like any sort of like more structured or like data that gets continuously added and updated. For these kind of things, a lot of the times companies specifically want to migrate that to keep like an archive. And what we've also done in the past is that we say, okay, this is the archive. We actually keep it exactly like it is. Maybe even leave some of the pages online and leave the system running and just link to that as like an archive. And then only new articles, new content that is created will have the new structure, so that we basically save the whole like migration story if it is too complicated. Yeah.
Right. So that will be strategy number one, not migrating actually, but keeping an archive somewhere. We've done that before when it was not so much about the public representation, but about ensuring that the data and information, past information, is still available from the past 10 years of, what was it? Some nonprofit organization, for example, that needed to document all those things. And then we kept, an archive somewhere on an old subdomain, redirected things and so on. So it could be still discovered by the public and by its members. Or in another scenario, we kept an archive only privately available for them. So they could internally still access that information because they used that public information for internal uses as well. And then they could still decide to migrate things manually somewhere.
Yeah. And in that case, you can either leave the system running, right, have it on a different subdomain, or you export like static pages and then have that, only the static pages, or maybe just really copy the HTML and put it into the post content in like a special post type, which is like archive entries, whatever. So that would be a good way to go. But like usually when it comes to migrating, the first question that I always ask when it's clear what should be migrated is then, okay, can we have access to the database, right? Because in a lot of cases, this, of course, works and we get this access, but sometimes also we don't get access to the existing system. And then it's like, okay, then we first have to create a scraper that gets all of the information out in a specific form, in a specific structure, so that we can then translate that to our components, the blocks or tags, categories, or other metadata.
And I think that this is already like one of the most complicated ways we did. But at the same time, very effective because we get a lot of control over the input and the output of the data. So that scraper would be like, a front-end scraping tool, which would crawl the website kind of, right? And we would detect certain sections of the page with probably something like CSS selectors and so on, and then fetch that data, categorize it, and then save it in a database or in a file, and then import that to WordPress, right?
Yes, exactly. So I always like to have data as cleanly or as specific or suited to what I need to do with it, right? So when we write our own scraper, we can of course choose how we want to have the data. When it's in a database, some people then tend to like get a database dump or whatever, and then use that data in the way that it is in the database, and then write like complicated PHP logic, whatever, to migrate then. But I always also say, okay, maybe create a view first, like use SQL or your database to create a database view and like put the data already in the structure that you can most easily work with. Because normally, also we use tools actually, or we use one tool for most of our migrations that we do, which is WP All Import or All Export Pro. There you have to upload a file. Like you cannot access a database directly, a different one, but you have to upload either a CSV or an Excel file and then process the data from there, right?
Okay, wait. I think
Yes.
like this is like 3 approaches that
Yes.
you just like talked about. Maybe let's go one by one first. So, but to keep track of them, we have the way to scrape data and import that. We have the way to access the database directly, and then to like create views and stuff like that. And then we need to talk about importing that data, getting that into the new system, kind of. And then we still can or need to talk about WordPress to WordPress migrations, if that's any different, right? Because the first one that we just like start talk about is the scraping approach. The great thing about that also, it can be applied to any website, right? It doesn't matter if it's a static website, if it's use it any kind of CMS, it just needs to be available to us and we can start scraping that data. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit, on how you typically do that? Like the scraping process, do you compile a list of URLs or a structure? Where do you save that data to, and so on?
Yeah, usually, like if you have a well-maintained website, you know that all the pages that you want to crawl are in the sitemap, like in the publicly available sitemap. So you fetch that sitemap, the XML. We usually use like Node.js, like JavaScript-based tools to do that, and then we like basically download all of the HTML files. And use like, as you said, CSS selectors and like some libraries that will parse the HTML document to extract the data that we want. And then we can see, okay, the main content is here, the headline is here, and with the followings as a CSS selector, then we have tags, categories, or dates, or like other metadata that usually in a well-built website have specific CSS selectors, right? Maybe you have to have different rules for like different data types. So then you have, for example, articles or posts that have a specific design or layout, and then you have events, news that have like other layout, and then you need to specify for which URL or how the scraper knows that a specific data type is present in the currently scraped URL. Yes.
And how do you get that data then into WordPress?
Yeah, and this is what then WP All Import Pro is for, or what we use it for usually, because we then generate an XML or CSV file, and we can upload that file to WordPress, and then you can determine which part, like, I mean, it's all row-based, right? One row is usually then one sort of post or user or whatever, and there you determine how the data is mapped, right? So you say which column goes into which field in the database. And this is actually the nice thing about this. Like initially we also like wrote some our own logic to do the migration and to read maybe a JSON file and do that. But the nice thing about WP All Import is that you have like this framework or this structure that allows you to throttle imports, also pause and continue imports and so on, because sometimes you have a lot of data, and importing thousands of items into a WordPress database can be quite slow. The fastest way would be to actually write your own SQL queries, right? So that you write it directly to the database. But then sometimes you want to modify the data, format it in a certain way. And also, for example, if you create tags and so on, you need to know what tags already exist, what are the IDs, you need to add stuff to a join table and so on. And all of that gets a bit tedious and is quite complicated. So it's most of the time easier to just upload a CSV or Excel file to a WordPress, do the mapping manually, like in the UI builder, and then do the import.
Can you also map then imports to fields like custom fields?
Yes, you can do that, and there are like extensions for that. And for like regular structured data, this is then why you also say like it's easy if you have like really structured data, like an event that always has like a title, a place, a start date, maybe an end date, maybe things like that. Then it's really easy to map because also with like the ACF add-on, you can just say, okay, I map this column to this field, right? So, you can do all of that in the UI builder. So that's pretty easy. When it comes to like flexible content and our component-based approach, then it gets a bit more complicated, and you usually have to write some extra code to do that. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm thinking all the time about content like text and fields, right? What about images?
Yes, for images, usually like the easiest way is if the images are publicly available. So if you like scraped data from a publicly available website, then you don't have to download the image with the scraper, but only the URL, and save the URL into a field. And then the importer will actually download this file from the URL that you specified and put it into the media library in WordPress, and then like you don't have any issues.
That's great. So you don't have to export, like download the images first, but you just scrape the URLs and pass that to the importer.
You can do that as well. Like there is a way to, if you have like a folder of images, like then you have to put like all the exported images into a folder on the web server where you import the stuff, and then specify like the file name only, not a URL. And then you can tell the plugin to take the files from the specific folder.
So yeah, this all works. It's possible. I think like many things in tech, if people ask, is it possible? Then many times the answer is yes, it is. It's just like a matter of time and money. Because this way of writing a scraper is a very custom manual way, even though the importing goes fine, but then still you need to do the mapping and you need to test things. Things tend to go wrong. Scrapers might fail. Then there might be edge cases and different types of data. The scope might change over time with discovering new content types and stuff like that. So how much time does it take? Usually, I think it's days of work that we need to invest into this.
Yeah, and it's always longer than you expect.
and it's always longer. Like when you think about it and say, yeah, it's probably 3 days. Yeah, it's probably going to be 5. But then you need to think about, is that worth your time? Like 3 to 5 development days or even more, I don't know, compared to someone doing copy and paste for pages in certain archives. And that really depends on the amount of pages. If it's hundreds of pages, yes, that might be very well the case, that it makes sense. If it's around 50 or something like that, I'd say probably not. Probably you might be even quicker and faster and might be even less error prone to copy and paste things. And because you also have the opportunity to optimize things on the go that you might want to change with the relaunch and so on. So we like to offer then this approach, but it's hard for us to make a decision. We can only make a recommendation and see how we get there. Should we talk about getting access to the database then and how you would approach that differently? You started talking about views already.
Yeah, like I mean, in general, it's basically just the import is always the same, right? For us, at least. So like any sort of data source that we have, we want to put into a CSV or Excel file. And yeah, then it's like you can get it from a scraper that you write yourself or that you use. And then you can get it from a database. But how do you get like from a database? How do you get the data in exactly the format that you want to import it to, right? And for that, you can either write a PHP script that does like some SQL queries and then puts it into an array and then does this and that. And in the end, you say, okay, now write a CSV. And sometimes in very complicated cases, you can do that. But usually it is faster and also more clear to create SQL views. So you write some SQL statements that will take different tables and combine them into one table, right? And also already label the columns correctly and have the rows so that in the end you just have to export a CSV file from the SQL table or view in this case. And this one you can take then to import directly.
So I assume you probably like export that existing database, create that on some kind of local development server, and then create that custom view. Those queries could probably be a bit complicated depending on how the existing data is structured, depending on the system that it is, because this also applies not only for WordPress, it could come from any kind of other CMS or website, right? And then you need to bring that into a nice and simple structure, because like databases, usually you try to abstract data in a certain way, right? And in the new structure, it might be just different. It might be the same, it might be similar, but it might be also very different depending on the CMS.
Yeah. So the thing is, like, you don't necessarily even need to like export the database and put it onto a test server or whatever. But if you create a new view, there's not a lot that can go wrong. It can just like put extra stress on the database, like because you're doing some reads that might slow down the database. But usually, because you're just a single connection that you're using, that's not really a big deal. But you're right, you have to know SQL. Like, you have to know how to write good queries or views. And sometimes, like a PHP developer who uses WordPress, I mean, there are not a lot of SQL queries that you need to write usually. Like normally for WordPress, you don't need to write any queries, only when you do some fancy stuff with custom tables or want to like optimize things or whatever. But yeah, if you know SQL, like your best bet is usually to go the route via views and not have like a PHP script do all of that, because also like this can get really computation heavy, right? If you have 10,000, hundreds of thousands of articles, then it's not feasible or not possible with PHP to like fetch them all from the database, do some in-memory modification of the data, and then like produce a CSV that is like 5 gigabytes big, right? So that just doesn't work. So you would have to do some batch processing. And then you do batch processing, you put like a lot of files on your disk, and then you have to combine them again. And then again, like you can even like, there are UI tools for databases. So if you have like open your SQL Pro, SQL Ace, or whatever, or PHP MyAdmin or whatever, you can, if you manage to write or to create a view that displays the data exactly like you want it, then you just hit download. And okay, downloading a 5 gigabyte file, yes, it will take long, but it's possible, and it doesn't like crash a server or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So can you write like a view that, or would the view be quicker if you only displayed kind of like the first 10 results to see if the data structure is correct, but you don't have to load all the data? Or maybe that's even a silly question because whatever UI you use doesn't like show all the data anyway, but I'm thinking it needs to probably process all the data. But like, how would you typically do that to speed it up? Because I just remember that I've written views that have been very heavy and very slow. Like I needed to wait. It felt like minutes, probably wasn't minutes, but like 15 or 20 seconds. And if you write complicated join statements and stuff like that, that can be very annoying to move forward with your query.
Yeah. If you put like 20, 50 or 100 joins, and with WordPress, this can be the case, right? Because you want to have all the data for one post in one row. So any sort of meta key, meta value, metadata that you want is not a row anymore, but like needs to be inside of one row. And for each of these keys, you need one join, right? So that's why like these views can be really expensive. But creating a view is not expensive. Creating a view is just like one command. Like querying the view is what is expensive. And then you can always say, okay, please query the first. And as you said, like most of the UIs, they have a pagination anyways, but usually like with like 1,000 rows or something like that, or 100 that they show. But you can easily like just query the first 10, check if it's correct, and then you like export this view as CSV. Like, and yes, you sometimes have to wait a bit, but you have to wait not nearly as long as you would need to wait when you use PHP for that.
Yeah,
I would say. Of course, it's edge cases, right? Because sometimes it's faster to query all the data at once in PHP, like especially for these like complicated join stuffs. So and then do it in PHP, but it's then the memory limit that you might hit.
Okay.
Because you have too much data in memory.
And when talking about this exporting into a CSV, I assume it's not just one CSV for all the imports, but one CSV per content type, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sometimes also it makes sense to have to split stuff up, right? So when you have it's not always necessary, and this is maybe not the best example, but for if you had like posts and you had tags, sometimes it might make sense to first put all of the tags inside of one CSV, just with the names, then import the tags that they already exist in the database, and then do like the import of the posts, and then only associating the tags and not creating new ones. This can also like speed up the process a bit, right?
Yeah. So how big is the effort compared to the previous approach, to the scraper approach? Do you think is it more or less effort, or it depends?
I would say the scraper is usually more effort. Like so it's always best if we can get database access.
And then what about WordPress to WordPress? How do you do that usually? Is there any difference? Is it the same?
Honestly, for me, there's actually normally no difference. I mean, there is like the WordPress exporter where you can export posts and so on, but usually we want to do something with the data, right? Modify it. And when you're used to this database creating views way, then this is the preferred way.
Because this WordPress exporter or default export functionality that it provides in import, I think it's best suited for standard posts, right? For standard blog posts, standard created HTML blobs, and where you would hopefully not have too much metadata, like additionally, like you probably have, the tags or categories, you have an HTML blob for the content, you have a title, you have a featured image, stuff like that. But if any data migration goes beyond that, I just like, I don't feel even comfortable, because I know that whatever website was created, what kind of custom theme. It might just have additional metadata that might not be exported or exported in a nice way. And I think you need to look into it in depth anyways. So I'd be curious to learn if anyone else is using the WordPress exporter. Write it down in the comments below, and what kind of other tools you maybe use or have made better or easier experiences with migrating WordPress websites. One bonus topic I'd like to talk about is SEO related. I think what you should always consider when thinking about migrating content, if it is actually good for you to migrate all the content, because we've had a rather successful client which did a huge migration on their website, where we rebuilt the whole website. And what I find kind of impressive was that they had a very deliberate strategy to not migrate certain content that wasn't performing well. So they took this as an opportunity to leave out content. And then they also decided to migrate certain content, but to set certain content then still to no index, because they did not want to have particularly old content indexed, to focus on the newer, fresher content. And that goes in the same way for all types of other content that you want to take over to your new website. I think it's a great opportunity to think about your content which is performing well and the stuff that is not performing well, and thinking about this as an opportunity to strip out things and to strongly optimize things, to also maybe join certain things together and so on. And yeah, I'd say don't always just treat it as oh no, now we're losing stuff, but see it as an opportunity at the same time.
Yeah, I agree.